9 o'clock, so I propose we start on time, and it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you all. So this is the first event of the ESA Around the Clock Global Conference, and it's really, I think, very exciting to see this very impressive program that will keep us awake for indeed a number of days. Now, I'm very happy and honored actually to be introducing our keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker today, who is Professor Michal Bauer, who is currently associate professor at Surge in Prague. He actually graduated in 2009 from Charles University in Prague. And his research is really, fascinating. He has it spans a variety of very interesting and socially relevant phenomena, such as poverty, discrimination, and conflict. And the common thread in its research seems to be to try to explore to what extent behavioral mechanisms can contribute to explain these phenomena. And just to give one example of one of his prominent lines of work, he has been interested in the causal relationship between war and cooperation, and war and religiosity. And one of his studies shows how exposure to war increases religiosity, which is interesting because they suggest there might be a potentially vicious circle between war and religiosity. And I think there might be some relationship with the work he'll present today. So in my view, Professor Bauer is really the model example of a true social scientist who's motivated by really important and interesting questions, and he's seeking to use the best methods to answer them. And his work is really truly inspirational. It's also published in the very best outlets in economics, but also given the breadth of his work, he has also several papers published in prominent interdisciplinary journals. So it's really great pleasure. I'm looking forward to the presentation today. Just in terms of logistics, we'll let Michal speak for 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A where you'll be able to either raise your hand and unmute yourself, or you can also drop questions in the chat, and I'll call on you. So Michal, the floor is yours, and take us away.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and also Michel for the super generous introduction. It's a really great pleasure to be part of this global online gathering of experimental economists. And today I would like to talk about some work that my collaborators and I have done on the issue of triggers of intergroup conflict. So as Michel has mentioned in some of my earlier work, I was interested in understanding the legacies of intergroup conflict. This research agenda is trying to look at a bit more on the sources of intergroup conflict, intergroup hostility, so how these conflicts, in which circumstances the conflicts between groups can arise. Now, this research agenda is a joint effort with a team of wonderful collaborators, Vojta Bartoš from LMU in Munich, Jana Cahlíková from Max Planck Institute in Munich, Julie Chytilová from Sergia and Charles University in Prague, Gerard Roland from Berkeley, and Tomáš Ženecký from the University in Košice. Most broadly, this research agenda is motivated by a stylized pattern that we often observe throughout the human history, which is that aggressive behavior towards ethnic minorities or other types of outgroup members often arise almost out of nothing, unexpectedly, and this type of behavior tends to spread relatively quickly among the masses. Now, that makes it really important to understand what are the factors, what are the reasons that can cause these sudden changes in behavior towards outgroup members. Now, we've learned a great deal from economic experiments. We've learned a great deal about the existence of in-group, out-group biases and ethnic discrimination in, so to say, normal circumstances or peaceful circumstances. Now, at the same time, we know much less, I think, about what are the psychological mechanisms or what are the forms of in-group, out-group biases and preferences that can lead to these changes in behavior and sudden escalations and amplification of aggressive behaviors towards people from our armed group. So that's essentially the focus of my talk today, to discuss and summarize the findings from two papers that try to look at this issue. The first paper focuses on unfair punishment and in particular on shifting of revenge and punishment on an ethnic minority in Slovakia. And the second paper focuses on something that we then, on what all of us tend to think a lot about these days, which is on COVID legacies and impacts of COVID-19 crisis. And we try to understand how fears related to COVID-19 crisis may affect social behavior towards other people, especially towards foreigners, and whether this crisis have created a greater divides in social preferences. Now it's clear that unfair punishment or magnified punishment towards members of certain groups can easily lead to spirals of aggressive behaviors and conflicts. And in principle, one can think of two important forms of biases in preference to punish. The first one occurs if people punish too harshly wrongdoers from an outgroup. If the punishment is of individuals from certain groups is more severe than punishment for the same non-violation committed by somebody from let's say a dominant group, because this can lead to cycles of vendettas and this type of bias in preferences to punish has been already looked at, starting from the classic paper of Benham, Fair and Fischbacher published in Nature, and there are 2 or 3 other papers looking at this issue. And some of this work indeed finds that the wrongdoers from the outgroup receive a harsher punishment for the same wrongdoing. Now, inspired by some work from social psychology, we also take seriously and focus on what is presumably more extreme form of unfair punishment, which is that when people cannot punish the true wrongdoer, they may decide to shift punishment and punish completely innocent individuals, especially if these individuals come from unpopular, negatively stereotyped groups. So in many situations in real life, people observe injustice happening themselves or somebody they care about from their own group, but often they cannot directly punish the true wrongdoer. And then the question is, what are they going to do? Will some people shift punishment and perhaps fuel their anger, as social psychologists describe, on innocent individuals, and especially individuals that are somehow negatively stereotyped, they come from negatively stereotyped groups. Now, I'm going to refer to this behavior as scapegoating, and it's potentially important behavioral phenomena if it exists, because it can drag innocent individuals into conflicts that are completely unrelated to their behavior. Now, these types of unfair punishments may arise if people harbor latent discriminatory preferences that are activated in this environment when they engage in punishment. And that can be due to anger, since they observe injustice, and some people may have a need to fuel that anger and redirect the punishment on somebody else. So that's and then an idea that sometimes appeared in social psychology literature, or it could be because punishment decisions may involve an element of moral wiggle room and greater scope for excuses. And during these circumstances, latent discriminatory preferences may more easily manifest. Now, the setting we'll be looking at is Eastern Slovakia, which is a medium-sized or a medium-sized middle-income country in Central Europe. And we'll be interested in the behavior of the dominant group of the majority population towards Roma minority. Roma minority is the largest ethnic minority living in the EU, and it's a minority of Indian origin, and in the setting we study, it represents around 15% of the local population. At the same time, it is heavily socially and economically disadvantaged in various ways. Most of the Roma people live in segregated locations from the majority group, and also the prevalence of poverty and unemployment is much larger for Roma than the dominant group. At the same time, there is no active conflict between Roma and the majority group, but there are certainly tensions and unfavorable stereotypes towards Roma. Now I'll summarize the main questions and the key features of the experimental design that help us to answer those questions. So there's been a lot of great work looking at people's preferences to punish, and the common feature of this work was to focus on studying direct punishment of individuals who make active decisions whether to violate a social norm or not. And there's been there's been a range of tasks that have been used, and we'll be building on one of the classic ones, which is the third-party punishment game. And in this game, there are three individuals, and one of them is this impartial spectator or punisher, and that punisher observes in our implementation two workers. Both of them work on a useful task, but then one of these two individuals, person A, I'm going to label that person the wrongdoer, can make a decision to harm, reduce earnings of person B. I'm going to label that person for convenience victim. Right. So, and then the question is, how does the punisher is going to respond to observing this malevolent antisocial behavior towards the victim, which is from the punisher's. And then the first question that, as I've mentioned, has to some extent been studied already, is whether people punish more severely individuals from the out group as compared to from the in group for the same wrongdoing. And in order to do so, we manipulate information that the punisher receives about ethnicity of the wrongdoer, whether it's somebody from the Roma minority or whether it's somebody from the dominant group, and then we are interested in the punishment response. Now, the main focus and I guess the main novel element of this paper is to understand scapegoating and to focus on the situation in which the punisher observes injustice happening to a member of his or her group, but a situation in which he or she cannot punish the wrongdoer. And then the question is, will the punisher punish a completely innocent bystander or a scapegoat? So to do so, we enrich the third-party punishment game paradigm and add a fourth person that I'm going to label a scapegoat. Now, this scapegoat is completely uninvolved with the original wrongdoing. In fact, these three individuals, the punisher knows that these three individuals do not know each other. They come from different localities. And then again, the punisher observes that there's been harm being done to somebody from his or her group, but he or she cannot punish the person A. But then the question is, what will be the behavior? Will the punisher punish this innocent bystander? Now, the main question is, and that we are after, is whether the identity of the scapegoat matters. Whether people are more prone to shift punishment, they are going to be more affected by the behavior of the wrongdoer when the scapegoat comes from the ethnic minority, whether they have a greater tendency to shift punishment on the ethnic minority. And then we try to understand and shed some light on the question why or in which situations this magnified shifting of punishment may happen. One potential explanation is that this magnified punishment of innocent individuals may reflect punishment by association or collective punishment, where the idea is that people may punish similarly looking individuals for harmful behavior of somebody else. And to do so, to understand this, we orthogonally manipulate also information in this punishment scapegoat task about the wrongdoer to see whether this magnified shifting of punishment happens particularly strongly when the scapegoat and the wrongdoer share the same group attribute when they are both Roma, or whether this is a behavioral response that is sort of more general and extends also to situations in which when there's a conflict within the dominant group, there is a harming happening within the dominant group. Both of these individuals are from the dominant group, and then the punisher can act antisocially towards a minority. So that's what I'm referring to minority scapegoat. So that's in a nutshell what we are after here. Now I'm going to tell you a bit more about the sample and the experimental task before summarizing my results. Now our sample are young adults. This is a lab-in-field experiment implemented among young adults in Eastern Slovakia. They are between 18 to 24 years old. The focus on this age range is partly motivated by the observation that hate crime and similar forms of aggressive behaviors towards minorities or outgroup members are disproportionately committed by juveniles and young individuals. At the same time, this is not a representative sample of young adults. It's a diverse sample, but it's not representative. Approximately half are students of local university, and the second half is a relatively representative sample of last graders from local high schools. Which were and the schools were randomly selected to be part of the study. In this talk, I'm going to focus on behavior of the dominant group of the Slovak majority sample towards the Roma minority. If I have time or there are questions, I can also talk about what is the behavior of the Roma minority in the similar types of situations. Now, before the observers make decisions, they are informed that they are matched with 3 workers and each of these 3 workers worked on a genuinely useful task, and they earned €8 for completing a task. They are also told that after completion of the task, one of these 3 workers, the one that I'm labeling wrongdoer, got an option to make a decision whether to keep the earnings of person B as they are, or whether he wants to reduce the earnings of person B. So that's going to be capturing this antisocial behavior happening to somebody from the punishers group. Person A, as I said, could keep the money, could keep the earnings at the original level, or reduce the earnings by 2, 4, 6, or 8 euros. And then the punishers are also informed that all these 3 workers do not know each other, that they come from different locations. And finally, that person C, the scapegoat, is completely passive, as I said, doesn't know the wrongdoer, and could not have affected the decisions of person A. That really tries to capture this idea how people are going to behave to complete bystanders when they see that there is an injustice happening to someone from their group. And then the subjects make decisions in 2 tasks. The first one is very similar to third-party punishment game. We label that wrongdoer punishment game, and in this task, the subjects can reduce the earnings of the wrongdoer by again 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8 euro, and in the and we use a strategy method to elicit the punishment decisions. The punishment decisions are costly the punishers need to pay 20 cents in order to reduce the rewards by €2 of one of the workers. Now, in the scapegoat punishment game, the punishers cannot punish the wrongdoers, but they can choose to reduce the earnings if they want to of the scapegoat. Now, a few more pieces of information about the way how information about identity were provided, how we manipulate information about identity. The first thing to bear in mind is that victim, the person B, is always of the same ethnicity as the punisher. So we really want to capture the situation when the punisher observes that someone they care about is harmed, and then how do they respond? And from earlier experiments, we know that people are relatively sensitive to and punish quite a lot when responding to harm happening to somebody from their input. And then we use 2x2 between subject design to manipulate information about identity of the wrongdoer and the scapegoats. We use pictures to signal ethnicity of these different workers. Specifically, we provide a composite picture with passport photos of 20 potential wrongdoers, 20 potential victims, and scapegoats. And each of these pictures come from different location and is homogeneous by ethnicity. So that's relatively clear signal of the group attribute. And the punisher knows that he or she is matched with one person from each picture, but they do not know from which particular person it is to preserve, in order to preserve anonymity. Finally, I should mention that before eliciting punishment decisions, we have organized a supplementary activity on a separate set of workers from different localities, so that the information that we provide reflect the reality and the punishment decisions are possible. Right. So what are the main findings? First, we start by looking at the direct punishment of the wrongdoers. So on the vertical axis is the severity of punishment in euros, and on the horizontal axis there's harm intensity. Now, not surprisingly, we see that people punish, and they punish quite a lot. The greater is harm, the greater is the punishment. The main interesting pattern here is that the slope of the punishment line is larger when the wrongdoer is from the ethnic minorities, around 20% larger as compared to the slope of the punishment line when the wrongdoer is from the dominant group, which shows that the Roma wrongdoers are more harshly punished for the same misbehavior as compared to the wrongdoers from the dominant group. At the same time, and I'm going to revisit this aspect, when there is no wrongdoing, we don't see that Roma would be less favorably treated. The discrimination arises in situation when people engage in punishment. Further, we illustrate these patterns, we test these patterns also in the regression framework and find that this interaction effect between harm intensity and identity of the wrongdoer is statistically significant and affects the punishment of the wrongdoer. This interaction effect is driven both by more people engaging in punishment when the wrongdoer is Roma, as well as by more severe punishment, conditional punishment. Right. So this is probably the main graph, the main result of this paper, in which we look at how people behave to these innocent bystanders depending on behavior of the wrongdoer. That's still on the vertical axis. This time on the horizontal axis is the punishment of the scapegoat. First thing to note, you can see that the punishment response is substantially smaller as compared to when people directly punish the wrongdoer. It's around 25% of the direct punishment, but importantly, identity of the scapegoat matters a lot. Scapegoating is twice as large when the scapegoat is from the Roma minority. People are much more prone to shift punishment on the Roma minority as compared to when the scapegoat, the passive person, is from the majority group. Again, when there is no injustice happening, or in peaceful circumstances, if you want, we don't see any discrimination. But discrimination becomes activated in the social environment, characterized by harming against someone from the decision from the punishers group, and substantial discrimination arises in these social environments. So Roma scapegoats are punished twice as much as the scapegoats from the dominant group, and again, these patterns are robust and statistically significant in the regression framework. As one of the robustness checks, we look at this interesting question: since the Roma are poor and essentially come from a lower socioeconomic status, one may ask whether the pattern we see is essentially behavior towards the Roma minority, or whether this is capturing more general behavior towards people from lower socioeconomic status. In order to, we don't find support in our results for the interpretation that these results are driven by lower socioeconomic status, because when we control for socioeconomic status that we elicited after the experiments, perceptions of socioeconomic status of the different workers, the main results are still robust. Okay, so now a few more thoughts about potential mechanisms, or how these patterns may relate to theories of discriminations or potential explanations. Now, I've already touched one potential explanation, which is that greater punishment may simply be an outcome of stable, unfavorable preferences to punish, preference to harm the minority. But this is not consistent with lack of discrimination when the wrongdoers do not do any harm. Right? We don't see that the Roma would be less favorably treated independently on the social environment. So when there's no harm, we don't see any discrimination. While it arises, it is activated when people make punishment decisions. So that's consistent with the idea of minority scapegoating or latent biases against the minority that are activated when people punish. And they may be activated either because when people punish, there is more scope for moral wiggle room and excuses to engage in harmful behavior, or it also, when people punish, it involves more negative emotions, and if some people need to fuel these negative emotions and anger on somebody else, especially if that person is from an unpopular group, this could lead to these latent biases to affect behavior. Now, another potential explanation is based on this idea of collective punishment that I mentioned at the beginning. That's not supported in our data either. We can directly test it in our experimental design because we find that the magnified punishment of the Roma scapegoats is not driven by the situation when the wrongdoers is also from the Roma minority. So we further disaggregate the punishment behavior towards bystanders, and you can see that most of the shifting of punishment on the bystander happens in the situation when there's a conflict, when there's harming behavior within the dominant group, and then people are asked how they are going to behave to the minority. So that's the dashed line here, and you can see that this is what primarily drives the behavior, while the solid line refers to this situation when both the wrongdoer and scapegoat are from the Roma minority, and this line, if anything, is below the dashed line. So, so we don't find support for the explanation based on punishment by association. Now I'd like to quickly summarize the findings from this first project on this topic of triggers of intergroup hostility. We find systematic evidence of magnified tendency, magnified preference to engage in revenge against an ethnic minority in Slovakia. That happens both when people can punish the wrongdoers, but also, and perhaps more interestingly, also in situations when they cannot punish the wrongdoers, but they can only shift punishment on an innocent person. Now, these biases in behavior that we see when people punish are above and beyond what we observe in normal peaceful circumstances. So, in other words, these results imply that even individuals that would not punish in peaceful circumstances engage, that would not discriminate in peaceful circumstances, they engaged in discriminatory behavior when they punish. And one potential implication is that therefore, the punishment decisions are particularly discrimination prone. And this can help to explain why very often researchers find systematic biases in judicial decisions, in sentencing decisions. Another potential implication is that minorities might be at greater risk of facing aggressive behavior when there are social problems and unfair behavior within the majority group, when this becomes a salient feature of the environment, and then people make choices how they are going to behave towards the minority. In these circumstances, there can be more aggressive behavior, more antisocial behavior towards the minority. Okay, good. So that's the first paper. Now I'm going to move on and talk about the effects of health and economic crisis, the COVID-19 crisis on social behavior. We of course know that COVID-19 crisis has a lot of unfortunate impacts on physical health, on mental health, on economic well-being. And therefore, the natural question is whether this hardship in these other domains may spill over into and affect behavior also in the social domain, and whether it can magnify or amplify divisions in the society and affect behavior towards foreigners or potentially other outward members. Now, from history, we tend to the historical evidence shows that intergroup conflicts are more likely to arise when there's economic and health crisis happening. And therefore, a natural question is whether this can be due to the shift in preferences towards outgroup members in these difficult circumstances. And this concern has been also mentioned from the outset of the COVID-19 crisis by scholars, but also various policymakers. Here is one citation of the UN Special Rapporteur de Varanes, who argued that COVID-19 may not be just a health issue, but that it can also be a virus that exacerbates xenophobia, hate, and exclusion. And thus, the goal of this project was to provide some data, some evidence that would try to identify causal effects of fears associated with the COVID-19 crisis on social preferences and harmful discrimination. Now, there are two main empirical challenges if one wants to address this straightforward question. The first one is to find an exogenous source of variation in fears that would not be correlated with time trends as well as with unobserved confounders between individuals. In this project, we use a priming technique to manipulate salience of thoughts about COVID-19 and estimate that this marginal effect of greater salience of COVID-19 crisis on social behavior. And the second challenge, if one is interested in particular to identify whether desire to harm and behave antisocially towards certain groups, is to have a clean measurement of social behavior and hostile behavior towards in-group and out-group members. And for that purpose, we have implemented a set of allocation tasks, set of experimental allocation tasks to understand social preferences and in-group out-group biases. So the first paper was based on lab-in field experiment. This is an online experiment that has been implemented during the initial stage of the COVID-19 crisis. It was implemented at the end of March 2020 in the Czech Republic. So we are moving a little bit. We are still staying in the Central Europe, but we are moving from Slovakia to Czech Republic. And the sample is a representative sample of the adult population in the Czech Republic based on the observable characteristics. So the subjects come from a main online sample in the Czech Republic that is used by professional survey agencies. We have partnered with one of them and integrated an experiment within a survey. Now, during this period, people faced severe restrictions on their mobility. Essentially, they faced lockdown, the borders were closed, no negligible fraction of people faced reductions in their income, and there has been a lot of uncertainty about how the crisis is going to evolve in the upcoming months. To measure social behavior and willingness to harm, we employ a task that we label help or harm task. This task combines features of the standard dictator game and the joy of destruction game. In particular, the subjects make decisions in an allocation task whether to increase or decrease a reward to an anonymous person at no monetary cost to self. But there is a salient default allocation, which is set at the level of 100 Czech crowns, which is approximately €4. And the subjects can allocate any amount between 0 and 200 Czech crowns. Now, we interpret the decision to increase the reward above the default allocation as an indication of basic pro-social behavior, while the decision to actively reduce the reward below the 100 Czech crowns serves as an indication of hostile behavior or antisocial. We measure social behavior towards various types of recipients. Subjects make a set of 17 allocation decisions. One important group that we are particularly interested in were how people are going to behave to foreigners, because especially at the beginning of the crisis, foreigners were often seen as source of the virus or spreaders of the virus, and thus the subjects were making allocation decision towards individuals living in the EU, in the US, Asia, and Africa. And we compare behavior towards this set of individuals, this set of recipients, with allocation to a random recipient living in the Czech Republic. In order to measure behavior also to domestic out-group and in-group members, another set of allocation tasks focused on individuals who all live in the Czech Republic, but who either share a group attribute with the respondent or not, in terms of locality, ethnicity, religion, and political party preference. To manipulate salience of COVID-19, we use priming. People were allocated in two conditions. In the COVID-19 condition, the allocation tasks were implemented after a series of questions on various individual COVID-19 related experiences, how they were affected in terms of their economic lives, employment, working hours, etc., in terms of their mental health, whether they experience COVID-19 symptoms, the extent to which they engaged in preventive health behavior and social distancing. right? So this module captures a host of experiences that characterize lives during pandemics, and we think this is a relatively natural and non-intrusive way of priming people with COVID, because it's relatively natural to ask about these issues during the COVID-19 crisis. So that we think reduces the scope for experimental demand effect, which is of course a ubiquitous aspect to think about in the priming studies. In the control condition, the subjects made the allocations before answering the questions on the COVID-19. So this allows us to estimate the marginal effect of greater salience, greater extent of thinking about COVID-19. Of course, even in the control condition, to some extent, people have COVID-19 in their minds, but what we are able to estimate is this marginal effect of greater salience. Now, here are the main results. First thing I want to note is that even in the control group, we see substantial divisions, substantial discrimination against foreigners. They receive substantially smaller allocations than domestic recipient. The second finding I want to point out is that people in the COVID condition allocate smaller amount of money to foreign recipients than in the control condition. The salience of COVID-19 reduces the allocations to the foreign recipients and amplifies this discrimination against foreigners. And this negative effect on behavior is most pronounced towards recipients from the EU, but holds also for the Asian recipient, US recipient, and to lesser extent to a recipient from Africa. Lower allocations to foreigners when COVID-19 is made experimentally salient. Now, these reductions in allocations are driven mainly due to increased prevalence of hostile behavior towards foreigners, which here the dependent variable is the likelihood of actively reducing the amount below the default allocation. And the picture would be quite similar even if we would define hostility as reducing the rewards up to 0. We see that prevalence of this type of antisocial behavior goes up. And in the COVID condition, and finally, this behavioral response on behavior towards foreigners is quite robust across demographic groups. So given that this is a diverse online sample, we can look at whether the behavioral effects is somehow systematically driven by a certain subgroup, or whether this is a more general response that holds across demographic groups. And although some of the coefficients are a bit different, the effect doesn't seem to be driven by well-defined social and economic group. Then let me mention two more things. We also show that the main results are not driven by reduced attention or fatigue by employing various types of tests, direct attention tests. We also see that the effects on allocations are not driven by more likely choosing the default allocation, which potentially could be interpreted as a sign of lower attention. In fact, we see that the effects on allocation are mainly driven by active decisions to reduce the rewards below the default allocation. And finally, I want to mention that in terms of the effects of the prime on behavior to individuals within the Czech Republic, we don't find entirely conclusive patterns. Overall, we find 0 to small negative effects on behavior towards recipients from different groups. It's certainly not the case that people would become more altruistic, more pro-social towards individuals from their in-group but whether there is zero effect or small negative effects on behavior from on behavior of individuals from the Czech Republic, we cannot say. Okay, so to wrap up, in this second project that I described, we find that some indicative evidence from the initial stages of the COVID-19 crisis that it may affect behavior in the social domain, and in particular, we find evidence of increased hostility towards foreigners when COVID-19 is made more salient. We think this pattern is interesting because, especially at the outset of the crisis, foreigners were often depicted as spreaders of the disease, and this pattern is therefore consistent with this idea that that aggressive behavior during hard times may be more pronounced towards people from groups that are somehow associated with the source of the issue or the source of the problem. Now, in terms of potential policy implications, these results would strengthen the case against associating or blaming foreigners or other groups with the crisis. And if these effects are persistent, they may also complicate international cooperations. Now, more generally, I think what these two papers, I hope, illuminate is that if we want to understand the role of discriminatory preferences or in-group, out-group biases in causing intergroup conflicts, it may not be enough to measure and test existence of discriminatory preferences in, so to say, peaceful circumstances, normal circumstances, and that what may be needed is to try to uncover and try to understand stability of outgroup discrimination and what are the factors or situations in which people become more discriminatory. I also think that these results suggest that we should take seriously behavioral channels through which deterioration of social and economic environment may fuel intergroup conflicts, and that focusing on the role of economic incentives in changing people's behavior to outgroup members may not provide a full picture, and that these behavioral factors may also be important. So I think I'm going to stop here. Thanks a lot for attention, and I'm looking forward to potential questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was really fascinating two projects actually, and very nice, related and current. So we'll take questions now. Either you can write the questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and I'll try to indeed identify people. There were quite a few questions actually on the first project in the chat, so I'll start with that. So Jakob, would you like to ask your questions?
Hi, yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for the very interesting talk. I have a question regarding the first experiment, just to clarify my understanding of the experiment. Mm-hmm. So my question is, what did the wrongdoer know about the possibility of being punished at the time that he decided whether or not to wrongdo, like to hurt the other participant? And like, I didn't understand what were the incentives to do the wrong thing, to hurt the other person.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. So we wanted to measure a truly antisocial behavior, so that we could expect strong urge to punish among the observers. So we didn't financially incentivize the wrongdoers to reduce the earnings, and therefore they could reduce the earnings without getting anything in return, right? So it was a costless decisions for the wrongdoers to reduce the earnings of somebody else, so that it's clearly antisocial behavior to which happening to somebody from the punisher's group, to which the punisher needs to respond. Did I answer your question, or was there?
Also, did the wrongdoer know that he or she could be punished for hurting?
So they didn't know about that. So it was not made clear. They were told some minimum amount that they are going to receive, and they know that so minimum level of earnings, and then they were told that they could get more depending on behavior of other people, but we didn't make clear how that is going to be determined. So there was not an explanation.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, so there were actually two other questions that were very related, which I believe you have actually answered from Alex and Yuping. But if Alex and Yuping want to ask or are sort of still unclear about some aspects, if you want to turn on your video and unmute yourself. Otherwise,
yes, indeed, it's a related question, but I'm just interested in this possibility of the wrongdoer to strategically harm the victim to induce the punishment on the scapegoat. So is it possible in your situation, or do you see behavior suggestive of this?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. That's another great question. So we wanted to close down these strategic motivations to shift punishment by design. So we think sort of it's an advantage of the experiment that we can sort of close down other mechanisms through which punishment of innocent individuals could happen. And you mentioned one of them, which is maybe providing moral education to the wrongdoer by punishing the scapegoat, for example. So we wanted to avoid this mechanism to play a role, although I think it's also an interesting mechanism to look at, and therefore the punisher knew that the wrongdoer would not be informed about their behavior towards the scapegoat. So there was no scope for, and also the wrongdoer was not, as I mentioned earlier, the wrongdoer was not informed that there would be this punishment stage later on. So it's unlikely that they would reduce the earnings for the strategic reasons.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Yuping, I also think your question got answered, but if you want to add anything, let us know. Okay, so I'll go to Dorothea then next.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the great talk. So I've mainly one small question and a little bit bigger question regarding the COVID study. So first of all, so this is just a remark, it seemed that the EU foreigners were most severely punished in the study, which I found interesting, and I wonder whether you have maybe this is just, it's not a significant finding, just a fluke, I don't know, but maybe you have some thoughts on this. And the second one was that you didn't find that people became more altruistic when being primed on COVID. And I think, we have some evidence that some people definitely, became more altruistic and did more things that they otherwise wouldn't do. And I was wondering whether it's maybe due to the way you primed COVID, namely you asked people about their personal well-being. They were all, related to their own life, these questions. So maybe it's kind of an artifact of the way in which you primed COVID. You didn't talk about, the general, you didn't ask them, what is your view on, how should society deal with this? How are, do you think are poor people more affected? You could have talked about this aspect of COVID, and maybe, I don't know, this is just a speculation, but I was just wondering why you got this negative result.
Thanks, Dorothea. These are great points. So first, in terms of the potentially greater effects on the recipients from the EU, this is a bit speculative because the coefficients are not statistically significant from Michal, but putting that aside, I think part of the reason could be that during the initial stages, a lot of spreading of the COVID happened through traveling and interactions with the foreigners within the EU. So maybe that was part of it. That there was this association, and also EU at that time was not very active in terms of trying to solve the crisis. It came later on with the vaccination. So I think this would be probably sort of my speculation, that people thought about the hard times they have, and they somehow tend to associate the crisis with interactions with people living outside. Now, in this context, it's a bit surprising, I must admit, that we don't see maybe larger effect for recipients from Asia. We see negative effects, but they are not larger than let's say, the effects on behavior towards people from the EU. So that was one of the things that we were also interested in, whether this is going to be specific towards the Asian recipients. So that's about the first question. Now, about potential effects on altruism. So you are completely right. I mean, part of the motivation of this project was both the motivation from history, which suggested that there may be negative effects on behavior towards outgroups, but also potentially, given the examples of very altruistic and community-minded behavior, a lot of people, we thought maybe there's going to be also a positive effect on altruism that you described. And in fact, in some of our earlier work, we see indications in the post-conflict societies when there is a sort of external threat and intergroup conflict that the bonds bonds within the communities become more important, and people start cooperating more. So that's why we also measured behavior towards clearing group members, like people living in the similar locality or having similar political preferences. But we don't see any positive effects on the social behavior towards this group. So that's what we find. Now, whether this is because of the way how we prime subjects, possibly it's true that we try to design the prime such that it focuses on individual level hardship. So that has been sort of motivated a bit by this literature on scapegoating, and some of that features these group level problems, and some of that features sort of intrapersonal problems. So I think the way to think about the prime is really more about priming individual hardship related to COVID and how people respond. So that's useful.
Okay, great. So at the moment, I see no further questions, so I can maybe ask mine then. So again, it's a very fascinating. But I guess this is very sort of thought-provoking to try to understand why is it the case that people blame foreigners or want to actually punish foreigners, and particularly in the second project, you sort of wonder, well, indeed, you hint that maybe they believe that the foreigners are more spreading the disease and so on. No, first question is, did you actually elicit any kind of beliefs, and do you have any questions that could that go in that direction? And second, I'm also wondering about the role of the media and whether there's maybe some legitimate reason, I guess, for people to believe that the foreigners might actually indeed play a role, and that these sort of it's often portrayed in the media as, I don't know, maybe the EU citizens who actually brought COVID or things like that. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I completely agree that this is more of an exploratory study, initial study on this question. So there, it also leaves a number of questions open, and one of them is precisely the mechanism. I mean, we didn't elicit, to answer your question, we didn't elicit associations between different individuals with the COVID. So that would be interesting, but we don't have data on that. We did something along the lines with the explanations based on media exposure. So whether this can be a role of media, we have relatively rich data from this panel on media consumption, and we don't find any systematic heterogeneity on those who consume media more and less, or who consume social media or other forms of media. So that heterogeneity is not systematic or not systematic enough to support this.
Okay, great. Well, fascinating. So we were actually told to end the keynotes as sharp at the hour so that everybody can go to their plenary sessions. But I want to thank you very much for this very, thought-provoking talk and fascinating, research. I think it will be inspiring for a lot of people. And thank you as well to the audience for attending this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.